John.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great. It's a pleasure to be here to speak with you today. I will also go over my conflict of interest disclosure slide. It's a little longer and a little wordier than Gary's. I think I work with even more companies than he does, and I travel around talking about sense of taste because it's something I'm passionate about. But let's just say that I drive a 10-year-old Mazda, and we'll leave it at that. So what I want to talk to you today is about the interactions we have between different taste qualities. So Gary gave us a really nice introduction in terms of taste, and I'm very interested in flavor more broadly, but for the purpose of this discussion, we wanted to really stay within one modality to keep things a little more tractable, because otherwise this session would take 8 hours, and we don't have time for that, unfortunately. So maybe another year we can come back and talk about some more of the flavor introduction issues. So as a psychophysicist, psychophysics is the oldest part of experimental psychology. And that is the field which studies the relationship between stimuli out in the environment and the perceptions that we experience in our brains. And it was invented back in the 1830s, 1840s, and for well over a century, there was this idea among psychophysicists that you could not measure sensation directly. We couldn't just ask people how strong something was. We had to do everything with various different methods that have been developed, like the method of constant stimuli. I give you two samples. I ask you which one is stronger or which one is weaker, and you could very laboriously come up with an entire construct of which sample was stronger than the other based on probabilities, etc. But then there was a critical breakthrough in the 1950s, which was S.S. Stevens, who was an eminent psychologist at Harvard, was arguing with a colleague. And the argument, according to Stevens, as he recounted it in 1956, was his colleague said, "You seem to maintain that each loudness has a number, and if someone sounded a tone, I should be able to tell him the number." And Stevens said, "That's an interesting idea. Let's try it." And so they tried it, and it worked. And that gave us the method that became known as magnitude estimation. And Stevens and his graduate students and others in psychology spent the next 20, 25 years documenting these dose-response functions, really. They're perceptual dose-response functions, connecting stimuli in the environment to what we perceive from them in terms of how strong they are. And because this is much more rapid than the ability to make a whole bunch of comparisons, it has lots of utility. But there were many skeptics, and even today there are many skeptics that you can't use these sorts of methods. But it always amuses me that while the psychologists were still debating whether or not you could actually do this, the food technologists were already just doing it because they're a very utilitarian type of people. So they were out there and doing that, and you'll see here's a quote from Howard Schutz, who just passed away last year, and Francis Pilgrim. And they say, "Many studies have shown people are quite capable of expressing their judgments of attributes or qualities directly on the basis of an underlying subjective continuum." And when we actually look at the data they obtained, we see very nice dose-response relationships. So these are the perceived intensity of various sweeteners, again, plotted against the concentration. And what you see here is that as you increase concentration, sweetness goes up, right? That's not rocket science. But there is one really remarkable thing here that you also see. The slopes of these lines are not equal to each other. And that's a critical point. That different stimuli the rate at which the intensity, in this case, sweetness, increases varies from stimulus to stimulus and from modality to modality. So a little more oral anatomy here. This is the Chorda Tympani nerve. The Chorda Tympani nerve innervates the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, and it carries all the taste signals that Gary told you about earlier. But the name of the Chorda Tympani nerve, it's not a random chance that it has that name, because anatomists like to be colorful in how they name things. And it actually runs past the tympanic membrane in the ear. So it actually is not a very intelligent design because it starts in the tongue and it goes through the ear on its way to the brain, which is not exactly how you would plan things, but that's what evolution gave us. And this also affords a really, really unique opportunity to the neuroscientists, because generally, if you want to do electrophysiology and you want to record from nerves, you have to cut into the skull of the animal that you're going to do that to. And we're generally not allowed to do that to people. However, in the rare case of taste with the Chorda Tympani nerve, you can actually access this during middle ear surgery. I'm not sure you'd be able to get through this IRB today, but that's exactly what Zoderman and colleagues did in 1967. They actually took advantage of a routine surgical procedure at the time where surgeons would cut the Chorda Tympani nerve, so you would lose taste function on the front of the tongue. That's not so good. But taste is redundant for reasons I can't go into today. And so you would actually get compensation on other oral surfaces. But they would cut the Chorda Tympani nerve, and they would actually record just like you would in a rodent model. They would record from the nerves and get the spike firing rates of those nerves while they put tastants on these people's tongues. So it's the only case I know of electrophysiology done in humans. And here's what the data look like. So over on the left in the red, we have citric acid, and the open circles are the perceived intensity rated using magnitude estimation. The closed circles are the firing rate of the Chorda Tympani nerve to the same stimuli in the same person. So whenever somebody says, oh, making intensity ratings is just subjective, this is the graph I pull up. Because this shows that people really can assign intensities, or rather, I should step back and be a little more conservative, and I should say the numbers that people assign in magnitude estimation correlate directly with the underlying neural event that we're experiencing physiologically. And so we see that again for sucrose. And again, you'll notice that they're both taste modalities here, but as these qualities within taste, they have different slopes. And we see this over and over and over again. So we see that, here's data from my laboratory, from Elliot McDowell, and Elliot went and gave all these different bitter stimuli to people, and you'll notice a couple different patterns here in these data. So on the y-axis, we have intensity, on the x-axis, we have concentration. You'll see all these different bitterants cover 5 orders of magnitude in concentration. Over on the far left, some of them are incredibly potent. So sucrose octaacetate, SOA, we can taste this at extremely low concentrations. So it has a low threshold. But I don't want to talk about thresholds today. I want to talk about super threshold response. And you see some of them, like urea, you need to use much, much higher concentrations to get the same bitterness. But the other thing that you'll see from this graph is that, again, the slopes are not all equal to each other. And this is also why we can't use thresholds as a proxy for intensity, because just knowing the detection threshold doesn't tell you anything about the angle that that intensity accelerates, okay? So the take-home message of this is that adding 20% more of an ingredient or taking 20% away does not change the intensity by 20%. These are not necessarily one-to-one relationships. They might not even be linear. These are actually log-log, these are plotted as log-log functions, so they're actually smoothing out the curves there to make them look more linear. But you really, in many of these things, we find asymptotic curves instead. So even where you are on the concentration curve. As a pet peeve, that's why it drives me nuts when people say sucralose is 300 times sweeter than sugar. To a psychophysicist, that's an absolutely meaningless statement, because you need to know the intensity, not just the weight of the detection threshold, okay? So Gary nicely talked about mixture suppression, but I want to dive much more deeply into it, because I think that fundamentally matters for how we formulate food. So here's some data from Harry Lawless from 1977, showing a phenomenon that's been well documented over and over and over again. Harry was not the first to show it. Kamens showed it in 1961. Pilgrim showed it. Pangborn showed it. Others had shown it. But this is one very accessible paper. And so what we see on the top is we see the sweetness of sucrose, and on the bottom we see the bitterness of quinine. And when you mix the two of them together in an equimolar concentration, what we find is that both the sweetness and the bitterness are still perceived and are still super threshold. We experience them as being fairly intense, but the intensity goes down. And the other big thing that we see from this plot is the effect is not symmetrical. Nobody recognized this back in 1977 when Harry did this work, but now we subsequently know that this asymmetry has been replicated over and over and over again. So sweetness and bitterness do block each other, but sweetness blocks bitterness much more than bitterness blocks sweetness, which evolutionarily doesn't really make sense. If the point of bitterness is to detect toxins, why do we want to cover that up? So I don't have an answer for you there, unfortunately. But the nice thing about this paper is, in 1977, our ability to graph things was not very good, which is why I've replotted the horrible table. But Harry provides all the raw means in a big table 1 in this paper. And so I went and I asked Molly Higgins to go and plot these as response surfaces. And so she did that for me. And so what we see here now is a response surface of the same data that Lawless had published. And so now on the axis over here, we're looking at the quinine concentration increases as you go back. Sucrose increases as you go in this direction. And then the height above this dose field, the z-axis, is actually how bitter it is. And so what we can see is that as sucrose concentration increases, there's no effect on bitterness down there. And we also see that as quinine concentration increases, it gets more bitter. That makes sense. That's not a surprise to anyone. But what we also see is this plane is not flat in space. It's tilted slightly. And that tilt, although subtle, is hugely important. And we see the same sort of thing for sweetness here, so that we see that, again, increasing quinine does nothing to sweetness. Increasing sucrose makes the sweetness goes up. Not a surprise. But again, the plane is tilted. So if we drop in some more lines here, we can now see, I've added a little line up here to make it easier to see in the dose field. You can see that there's actually a 28-point drop in the bitterness here. So what I have over here is I have quinine by itself, and its bitterness is about a 74. But if I take 1 millimolar quinine and I mix it with 1 molar sucrose, I get this huge suppression of the bitterness. And then the same thing is true over here. And again, we see the same asymmetry we saw before. So sweetness and bitterness are in opposition with each other, but the effect of sweetness on bitterness is bigger than the effect of bitterness on sweetness. And so this has been shown in model systems. But then the question becomes, well, does this happen in real foods? And then also, what happens with liking? So here, we have the same dose-response field now, but we're looking at overall pleasantness. And I've added a line here to show you where neutral is. And again, what we see is when you have quinine by itself, concentrated quinine, it's gross. Nobody likes quinine by itself. If you mix quinine with sucrose, however, it's still disliked on average, but the disliking is half as much. In fact, some of you might like this beverage. Add a little more carbonation, and we call that tonic water. So if you had a gin and tonic last night, you're experiencing this phenomena. So tonic water has a ton of sugar in it, which we don't realize because the bitterness and the sweetness from the quinine and the sucrose are suppressing each other. So the other thing is, if you take this data, there's some paradoxical effects that are worth talking about. And so we can see over here on the right-hand side that this classic inverted U that we see with concentration. So 1 molar sucrose is viscous. It's thick, it's syrupy, it's cloying, it's really gross. If you actually add some quinine to that viscous, syrupy sucrose, liking will actually go up. And so when you go back to the original paper and you look at those values, what you find, and that's what Harry looked like in 1970s, so what you find is that you get this hedonic enhancement effect where adding bitter quinine, we're always taught that quinine makes that bitterness is disliked. And yet by adding quinine, you're actually increasing the liking because you're driving down the sweetness when the sweetness was too intense. So the take-home message here is that there may be counterintuitive, paradoxical effects due to these kind of interactions. So this is why I can't just know the quinine concentration and know the sucrose concentration and predict liking. I actually have to measure the perceptual interactions along the way. Okay. So there are actually 3 different ways to measure bitterness, and I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because I know Chris is going to come back to these later. But we talked about central perceptual interactions with another taste or possibly smell. I know in my lab we have a pile of unpublished data trying to push down bitterness with sweet smells, and it didn't work, but I think I now know why it didn't work, so ask me later. You can use physical approaches where you actually encapsulate or otherwise bind or otherwise partition that bitterant to keep it from activating the receptor in the first place. Or you can actually modify activation at the level of the receptor. You can use a direct antagonist. That's great for drugs. It's a little harder with foods because we don't have direct antagonists for most foods. So here's data from Kelsey Tenney's master's thesis. And so what we observed there was that quinine, we mixed quinine and we mixed caffeine with a whey protein isolate. And so the quinine binds to the whey protein isolate much more than caffeine. And so this is a partitioning effect. And you see here the aqueous concentration as we increase whey protein isolate. So when you add more and more whey protein isolate, the amount of caffeine that stays in the aqueous phase is constant. It never goes down, right? That's why this line is flat here. But when you add more whey protein isolate, it just binds all that quinine up. So the quinine is still present, but it's not in the water phase. And if it's not in the water phase, then we think it shouldn't be able to access the receptor and it shouldn't be as bitter. And the effects aren't huge, but that's indeed what we see. When you add whey protein isolate to mix it with quinine, so the black bars are with protein and the white bars are without protein, you see you get a small but significant drop in the bitterness of quinine, and you get absolutely no effect for caffeine. So by physically partitioning it and making it harder for that taste to get to the receptor, you can push down bitterness. So this is another technology that we can use. And I know Chris is going to talk about this a little more. So we've heard already about how salt suppresses bitterness. So this is a peripheral interaction. And so here we see two different sets of quinine and caffeine data. And we see that the dose response curves, as you add more and more sodium chloride, are pushed down. So this means we've suppressed bitterness by adding saltiness. We actually know that this is a peripheral event, not a central event. So I didn't have time to get into it, but for the sweetness, we know from other studies, from split tongue studies, where if you paint sucrose on one half of the tongue and quinine on the other half of the tongue, they'll actually suppress each other even though they're hitting different parts of the tongue because the signals aren't crossing until you go higher up into the brain. Where this is happening out at the periphery. The other thing that's interesting here that's really important to notice, this is not due to the perceived saltiness. As Gary said, but I want to re-emphasize, this is due to the sodium ions, because you can do this with sodium salts that don't taste particularly salty, and you still get the same effect. So the effect is due to the sodium ion, it's not due to the perceived saltiness, which is yet more evidence that it's not a central perceptual phenomena, it's a peripheral receptor level phenomena. And part of the way that we know it actually occurs peripherally is a split tongue study that was done back in the 1980s. And what was this involves this crazy apparatus, plexiglass thing with flow chambers where you clamp the subject's tongue into it and you put one solution on one side and another solution on the other. And this paper is an absolute bear to read, but the take-home message is really interesting. What they found was that when they had saltiness and bitterness together, when they had quinine and salt together, they found a total reduction in the bitterness of almost 70%. But of that, they were able to mathematically model the proportion that was a central perceptual phenomena and the amount that was a peripheral phenomena. And when they did this, they find that 2/3 of the suppression that you got of the bitterness by saltiness happens out at the periphery. Which leads me to data that Gary already showed you. And so it's always good as an educator to hit ideas again, which is why I left this slide in here. So this is the data that Gary showed you, replotted. So again, we're seeing sucrose and urea. You mix them together, we get mixture suppression. So bitterness and sweetness push each other down. And then when you add sodium ions here, not salty things per se, but sodium ions, you actually get release from mixture suppression, which refers to this rebound, where now, because we've blocked the bitterness, the sweetness comes back up. So there really should be an arrow going up here to show you that we've actually released the mixture suppression. So now we have a peripheral event, a central event, they interact with each other, so this layers even more complexity. But again, these are model systems. Is this interesting in real foods? And yeah, it turns out it is. Here's a series of Morton salt ads from the 1940s that I really like. And you see that they just come out and say, grapefruit tastes sweeter with salt. Try salt on this grapefruit. What's this? A salt and grapefruit sale? And I really like this World War II era one because you can barely read it even up here because it's tiny, but in the back you definitely can't. But this is talking about victory and war bonds. And they're actually telling you that Vitamin-rich grapefruit is a victory food special. It's one of the fruits Uncle Sam advises you to eat, and it tastes even sweeter with salt. So they actually co-branded Morton's salt with grocers, set the salt up right next to the grapefruit during the Second World War to try and get you to buy these together. And I find this really interesting because if you consider there was sugar rationing. So you couldn't use mixture suppression of sweetness to bitterness. How many of you sugar your grapefruit to make it taste better? Well, sugar wasn't available, so instead by using salt, you're using a peripheral event instead of a central event to make that grapefruit taste better. This is also why people salt watermelon. Okay? But it also happens in other real foods. Here's data from the University of Connecticut, from Valerie Duffy's lab when I was her graduate student. And so we fed people regular sodium cheddar cheese. We fed them low sodium cheddar cheese. And guess what? When you change the sodium content of the cheese, what happens to the saltiness? Goes down, right? That's not too surprising. But you can guess what the next panel is going to show you. That's what happens to the bitterness. So the low sodium cheddar is twice as bitter as the regular sodium cheddar. So now when people were talking about formulation, making salt replacers, we're not just worried about replacing the saltiness, we also have to worry about the multifunctionality of sodium. So if you take out, even if you could replace the saltiness, if you can't also knock down the bitterness, you're going to end up with a product that's not very well liked. And I think that's a nuanced point that we have to bear in mind. And you can only imagine what this does to the liking. But here's what the data looks like. So when something is salty and not bitter, people like it. And when something is not very salty and bitter, people don't like that cheese. And Pangborn warned us of this. The matriarch of sensory science in North America told us that a change in one ingredient can alter several attributes simultaneously. And this has important sodium reduction implications. And here's data from Marianne Gillette that, again, looks very familiar. And I wanted to highlight two specific points, that when you add sodium in chicken broth, we see the same effects of saltiness increases, but bitterness decreases. So lately, my lab group has been looking at using mixture interactions to try and make veggies taste better. We know from paper after paper after paper that when vegetables are bitter, people don't like them. Or at least people, that's what they'll, in the laboratory, that's what the data show. And out there in the world, people will tell you that. We can have a separate debate whether or not that's actually true, but that is a paradigm people have been chasing for 20 plus years. So we simply took very, very, very small amounts of sugar, extremely small amounts of sugar, and we mixed them with purees of broccoli, spinach, and kale. And what you see is that the bitterness drops. And you can also see we included salt as a control, and salt works as well. So both sugar and salt will knock down the bitterness of these vegetables when you use very low amounts. And as you would guess, when you knock down the bitterness, this is what happens to the liking. So you'll notice the kale is still never liked. It's still disliked, but it goes from being really disliked to only moderately disliked. Whereas the broccoli, and I know some of you are thinking, this is absolutely disgusting, right? I don't want to eat sweet broccoli. But don't we essentially do this already culinarily when we roast things and we release all those sweet compounds and we caramelize up our Brussels sprouts? So we consider it socially acceptable to do this culinarily, but or even if you just put a honey glaze on things, or you put a cheese sauce with salt on it, that's all considered okay, but simply just adding sugar is verboten. And in fact, when we asked parents about this, we gave them the statement, I would be willing to give a young child aged 6 months to 3 years, vegetable preparations with sugar added to mask the bitter taste in an effort to increase vegetable consumption. And on a Likert scale, they were relatively neutral, a tiny bit positive, but relatively neutral. We asked people about 8 calories, half a teaspoon, 16 calories, 1 teaspoon, and you can see that even just referring to the same amount, for those of you that don't know, half a teaspoon of sugar is 8 calories, so it's just which unit you use. And you get a statistically different answer depending on whether you talk about it in terms of calories or teaspoons, which I think is really interesting from a health messaging standpoint. But then the thing was, when we actually looked at the data, the endorsements of the individual Likert categories, what we see is parents really didn't like this idea. There were about a third of parents that were like, nope, not doing it. And that's really fascinating because the food industry is already doing this. And so here's data from Cameron Moding And so what she showed is she did this extensive analysis of over 500 different infant and toddler foods on the market. She surveyed every infant and toddler food on the market in the United States in a fixed period of time, extracted the nutrition data from them, and made calculations across all these different categories. And what I've highlighted for you here is that vegetable, when blended with fruits, look at the sugar content of those. So the food industry is already adding sugar to vegetables to increase the palatability in the commercial products that are being sold today, but they're not doing it by adding sugar because that would be verboten. They're doing it by blending it with fruit. And so this raises a critical question of when you blend it with fruit, what happens to the flavor of the vegetable? This is Gary's point about the priming. If I've blended it with fruit and now covered up both the bitterness but also that vegetable flavor, do we get learning? And that's an open research question. That's an area where we really need to find out more. Okay. So I'm going to end on umami as well, because I was asked to talk about umami. And here's a different quote from around the same era. And it says, "The attentive taster will find something in common with the complicated taste of asparagus, tomatoes, cheese, and meat, which is peculiar and cannot be classified under any of the well-defined 4 basic taste qualities." And I want to point out the fact that many of those foods listed are foods that are highly consumed in Western diets. And in fact, us using umami as a Japanese loanword to describe meaty, savory sensations, I think is purely a quirk of history. Because if you go back and you look at Savory and 1826 in Physiology of Taste, you find this quote that says, "Osmosome is the purely sapid portion of flesh soluble in cold water. It's the most meritorious ingredients of all soups. The portion of the animal forms the red portion of flesh and the solid parts of the roast. It gives game and venison its peculiar flavor." To me, this is umami. And so I'm not a linguist, so I might be off base here, but I think the fact that the French were writing about meaty, savory, brothy sensations 80 years before the Japanese discovered umami, this is not a competition between the Japanese and the French. This is merely to say this is a quirk of history that we find these ubiquitously across all cultures. And indeed, when we look at a map of foods that contain umami character to them, we see that they're consumed globally and ubiquitously. Whether it be anchovy paste in Scandinavia or ketchup in Pennsylvania, right? Heinz ketchup is the only kind of ketchup that you should ever have on your table. I have to say that as a Pennsylvanian. Whether it be your Vegemite in Australia or your Marmite in the UK or Ngoc Mam in Vietnam, these foods are consumed globally. So this idea that umami is this foreign thing that we had to borrow a word from Japanese, I think is just really interesting historically. Okay, so the last thing I want to say is, can umami ingredients be used as salt replacers? And this is really to set up Jane's talk a little later. But there is this idea that you can use umami as a salt replacer. But umami is its own taste, it's not saltiness. And so you do find papers out there, but the problem with these is you just have to be really careful. And some of them do this. I don't mean to say these specific papers don't. But if you take the salt out and you put soy sauce back in, you're still adding salt back in. Or if you put MSG back in to replace the salt, what's the S in MSG? It's sodium. So you need to be careful when you look at these papers, because sometimes they don't adjust for the weight of the sodium they've added back in. And then they claim that umami is doing all this bitterness suppression or increasing the liking when they've really just added sodium back. So you need to be careful of that. And I want to close by talking about this idea that maybe we don't have to use monosodium glutamate. Here's one paper that I found that used calcium diglutamate, and they actually looked at salt concentrations. And this is a contour plot, so it's a little tricky to interpret. But I want to really point out this is liking. This is not saltiness and not savoriness. They're not trying to match the product for the same amount of salt intensity. They're trying to match the product for how good it tastes, for how much people like it. And what we see is that adding calcium diglutamate increases broth liking at moderate sodium levels. So they couldn't take out all the sodium, but by taking at a lower sodium level and then adding dicalcium glutamate, they were able to increase the liking even more. Okay, and I know that's a theme that I think Chris is going to hit on a little later as well. So my take-home messages. The relationship between concentration and intensity is never one-to-one. So don't assume you can just take out one ingredient and affect one thing. That's why food formulation is really, really hard. Central and peripheral effects interact to influence perception. And so changing one ingredient has a multiplicity of effects. If I take the salt out, I have to worry about bitterness. I have to worry about saltiness. I have to worry about sweetness from release from mixture suppression. Reducing bitterness does tend to increase liking, but the two easiest ways to do this are to add sugar and add salt. Are we supposed to add sugar and salt? Audience participation, are we supposed to add sugar and salt to things? No, right? And yet that's the easiest way to block bitterness. So that's a philosophical question we all have to wrestle with. And then finally, umami and savory flavors are ubiquitous across all cultures in the world. We may not realize that from our semantics of how we talk about it. They might work as salt replacers, but we need more research on that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. We do have time for 1 or 2 questions. So please go to the mic and introduce yourself.
Hi, Jake Beckerman, Harvard University. I'm curious you showed a lot of data about liking. Who is in those studies? Anecdotally, people from other countries come here and say that our desserts are way too sweet. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Right, so the question was about cross-cultural differences. And I don't tend to do cross-cultural work because, frankly, it's hard enough to get this kind of human behavior work funded in one country, so then to do the same study in 3 or 4 countries is almost impossible. I've tried to get NIH to fund cross-cultural work and not had much luck. So in the data that I showed, these are typically convenience samples, not university undergraduates, but convenience samples from relatively rural parts of America that are predominantly white. So yes, there's a huge question in generalizability here too. We do know that biologically, though, a lot of these drivers, bitterness is disliked pretty much globally. I mean, we even see that conserved across species. The fact that we can give different species bitter things and you get facial grimaces that show that response is conserved, I think it's not a huge stretch to say globally people don't like bitter. As, there are country-specific effects, of course, but.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Taryn, and I work in the, functional food industry, so to speak. I just have a question that's more based on a personal curiosity, but it seems that you can train people to be more acceptable to bitter taste. Just personally, I've trained myself to take the sugar out of my coffee and milk over time, and now it doesn't bother me. So. And I think people do that with functional foods too, like, oh, this is good for me, therefore I'll train myself to accept it. And I'm curious if that's actually a shift in your taste receptors that's happening that desensitizes you, or what's happening that allows the body to accept the food?
Right, so that's a fantastic question. And it really comes down to, we have to be very careful when we talk about liking as a function of sensation. Are you seeing a sensory shift or are you seeing an affective shift? And in those cases, we're really seeing an affective shift. We're not seeing a sensory shift. It's not, or at least there's no convincing data that there's a sensory shift. Bitter is still bitter. It now becomes the bitter doesn't bother you. And I took those slides out because I know Deborah's going to talk about conditioned learning later. But Martin Yeomans has really lovely data showing that if you caffeine deplete people and then you give them novel flavors with caffeine as a reinforcing stimulus, and then they'll learn within 4 exposures to like that novel flavor. Ethically, we're not going to go and give kids caffeine pills with their broccoli. But scientifically, it would work. But I'm not recommending we do that.
Why don't we take the last question?
Yeah, I'm Obina. I'm from the Department of Human Nutrition, University of Ibadan in Nigeria. I just want to make you to give me some clarification on 2 things. One, can perception and taste, can there be conflict? For instance, when you have a food that appears appealing, but when you taste it, it's like bitter or sour. So what information goes to the brain? Which one will be higher? Because perceiving it, you have a high expectation, but tasting it, the expectation seems low. That's one. How do you manage that? Then two, in drug manufacturing, you have some drugs that have bitter tastes. Can there be a relationship between healing through drugs that could be bitter or sweet? Which one can confer better healing to those who take them, considering the effect on the brain? How does the brain perceive bitter drugs and sweet drugs, then vis-a-vis healing?
Yeah, so I'll try and do this as quickly as I can because I know we need to move on. But they're great questions. And we can come back in the panel. The first one is, yes, expectancy is huge. And when you get disconfirmation of expectancies, bad things happen for liking. The best example of this is if you give people salmon-flavored ice cream and tell them it's salmon-flavored ice cream, they don't like it. If you give people salmon-flavored ice cream and tell them it's a salmon dessert mousse, they like it. So the exact same ice cream. So Heston Blumenthal was involved in that project. So that's kind of fun. In terms of the drugs, I actually do a lot of work in that area, but I'll save it for the panel discussion because I know we have to get Chris up here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John.